It was just a stupid party game. Everyone was giving silly, unrealistic answers about celebrity hall passes. I said Drake because it was obvious and funny. Like, who wouldn't? He's being completely dramatic about something that would never happen in a million years. Why can't he take a joke? Everyone keeps acting like I committed some unforgivable sin, but they're completely missing the context of what happened that night. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxed evening with our closest friends. Nothing serious or heavy, just good food, wine, and the kind of silly games that make for great memories and inside jokes later. Marcus and I had been hosting these dinner parties for months, and they'd become this wonderful tradition that everyone looked forward to. We'd spend hours planning the menu, setting up our dining room to look Instagram perfect, curating playlists that would keep the energy light and fun throughout the evening. It was one of my favorite things about our relationship, how well we worked together as a team, how effortlessly we could create these magical nights that brought our friend group closer together. That particular Saturday, we'd invited 6 of our closest couple friends over for what was supposed to be an early fall celebration. I'd spent the entire afternoon preparing this elaborate charcuterie spread, roasting vegetables, making homemade pasta from scratch. Marcus had handled the wine selection and playlist duties. Plus, he'd rearranged our living room furniture to create better conversation flow. Everything started perfectly. People arrived right on time. Everyone was in great moods. The food turned out exactly as I'd planned. The conversation flowed naturally from work stories to vacation planning to harmless gossip about mutual friends. Marcus and I kept catching each other's eyes across the room, sharing those little moments of pride and satisfaction that come from hosting a successful party. After dinner, when everyone was pleasantly wine-drunk and relaxed, someone suggested we move to the living room for games. Not board games exactly, but those conversation games that couples in their 20s love. The kind that feel sophisticated and adult, but are really just excuses to learn interesting things about your friends and make everyone laugh. We started with some basic questions about childhood memories and embarrassing moments, everyone taking turns sharing stories that got progressively funnier as the wine kept flowing. The energy was exactly what I'd hoped for. Warm, inclusive, slightly chaotic in the best possible way. That's when Jenny, who'd probably had one glass too many, suggested we play the Celebrity Hall Pass game. The concept was simple. Everyone had to name one celebrity they'd hypothetically be allowed to cheat with if given the opportunity, no consequences or jealousy from their partner. It was framed as this light-hearted thought experiment about fantasy versus reality, the kind of silly question that reveals nothing meaningful about anyone's actual relationship intentions. The responses started out exactly as ridiculous as expected. Tom said Scarlett Johansson, which made his girlfriend Amanda roll her eyes and remind everyone that he'd been saying that since college. Amanda countered with Ryan Gosling, sparking a debate about whether The Notebook was actually a good movie or just effective emotional manipulation. Jenny picked Michael B. Jordan, which led to a 5-minute tangent about Black Panther and Marvel movie rankings. Her boyfriend Dave went with Jennifer Lawrence, claiming he'd been in love with her since Silver Linings Playbook, but acknowledging that ship had probably sailed after she got married. Sarah chose Chris Evans, specifically in his Captain America costume, which somehow evolved into a heated discussion about superhero attractiveness rankings and whether Thor or Captain America was the superior Avenger. Her husband Mike surprised everyone by picking Zendaya, leading to jokes about robbing the cradle and generational differences in celebrity crushes. By the time it got to Marcus, everyone was laughing and making increasingly elaborate jokes about their hypothetical celebrity encounters. He thought for a moment, then said something about how he'd probably pick someone completely unexpected like Helen Mirren, just to be different. Everyone found this hilarious, especially since Marcus was notorious for having very conventional taste in everything from music to food to movies. Then all eyes turned to me, and I felt that familiar pressure to be entertaining, to come up with something clever that would get the biggest laugh and keep the party energy going. Everyone was looking at me expectantly, waiting for my contribution to this silly game that had already produced so many funny moments. Without really thinking about it, I shrugged and announced that obviously I'd pick Drake. The response was immediate and exactly what I'd expected. Laughter, teasing comments about my basic taste in music, jokes about whether I'd want the Drake from his rap era or his more recent pop phase. Someone made a comment about how I'd fit right into one of his music videos, and someone else started doing an impression of his dancing from the Hotline Bling video. I basked in the attention and laughter, feeling like I'd given the perfect answer. Drake was famous enough to make the fantasy feel appropriately unrealistic, attractive enough to be a believable choice, and current enough in pop culture to generate lots of fun conversation. Plus, there was something appealingly straightforward about picking someone so obviously desirable. No weird explanations needed, no justification required. But as the laughter died down and the conversation moved on to other topics, I noticed that Marcus had gotten quieter than usual. Not dramatically so. He was still participating in conversations, still refilling people's wine glasses, still playing the good host. But there was something different in his energy, a subtle shift that only I would have noticed after 2 years of reading his moods and expressions. When our friend started getting ready to leave around midnight, Marcus was polite and warm with everyone, thanking them for coming and making plans for future gatherings. But I could tell something was off in the way he was avoiding sustained eye contact with me, the way he seemed to be going through the motions of hosting rather than genuinely enjoying himself. I figured he was just tired or maybe feeling the effects of the wine more than usual. We'd both had quite a bit to drink, and hosting parties was always exhausting even when they went perfectly. It seemed reasonable that he might be ready for everyone to leave so we could clean up and decompress together. But as I hugged our friends goodbye and thanked them for such a fun evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted during those last few hours. The easy, affectionate dynamic between Marcus and me felt strained, in a way I couldn't quite pinpoint. After everyone left, I expected us to fall into our usual post-party routine, collapsing on the couch together, rehashing the funny moments from the evening, maybe opening one more bottle of wine to extend the good vibes a little longer. Instead, Marcus immediately started clearing dishes and cleaning the kitchen with an efficiency that felt more mechanical than collaborative. When I tried to help or start a conversation about how well the evening had gone, his responses were polite but distant. He wasn't being rude or obviously angry, but the warmth and intimacy that usually characterized our interactions was completely absent. I finally asked directly if he was okay, if something had happened during the party that upset him. That's when he made that comment about me wanting to cheat for fame, and everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. He wasn't tired or drunk or randomly moody. He was hurt by my Drake comment in a way I'd never anticipated or considered possible. The atmosphere in our apartment changed so dramatically after that conversation that it felt like someone had physically altered the temperature and lighting. What had been a warm, cozy space filled with the lingering energy of a successful party suddenly felt cold and unfamiliar, like I was staying in a hotel room rather than the home Marcus and I had built together over the past year. Marcus finished cleaning the kitchen in complete silence, his movements sharp and efficient in a way that made it clear he wanted the task done as quickly as possible, rather than enjoying our usual collaborative cleanup routine. Normally we'd put on music and work together, sharing observations about the evening while we washed dishes and put away leftovers. He'd often come up behind me while I was loading the dishwasher, wrapping his arms around my waist and making some joke about my organizational methods. None of that happened. He cleaned his assigned areas methodically, stored the leftover food without asking if I wanted to save any particular dishes, and wiped down counters with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for much more important tasks. I tried several times to restart the conversation, to explain that the Drake comment had been meant as harmless fun rather than any kind of serious statement about my relationship satisfaction or fidelity. But Marcus wasn't engaging with my explanations. He'd nod politely when I spoke, make non-committal sounds of acknowledgement, then returned to whatever cleaning task he was focused on. The silence between us grew heavier and more uncomfortable as the evening wore on. By the time we finished restoring the apartment to its normal state, it was well past 1 in the morning, and the easy intimacy that usually followed our dinner parties had been completely replaced by this strange, formal distance. When we finally went to bed, Marcus went through his normal nighttime routine, brushing his teeth, changing into pajamas, checking his phone one last time, but everything felt performative rather than natural. He got into bed on his side, said goodnight in a tone that was polite but final, and turned away from me toward the wall. Usually our post-party nights ended with us talking through the evening's highlights, maybe making out a little if we weren't too tired, definitely falling asleep touching in some way. Instead, I lay there staring at his back, trying to figure out how a silly party game had created this chasm between us. I barely slept that night, replaying the Drake comment over and over in my mind, trying to understand what Marcus had heard that I hadn't intended to communicate. From my perspective, it had been an obviously hypothetical response to a ridiculous question. Drake was a celebrity, someone I'd never meet, let alone have the opportunity to cheat with. The entire premise of the game was that these were fantasy scenarios with no real-world implications. But clearly, Marcus had interpreted my answer differently, hearing something in my tone or seeing something in my expression that suggested genuine desire or intention rather than playful engagement with an absurd thought experiment. The next morning brought an even more dramatic shift in our dynamic. I woke up to an empty bed and the sound of Marcus moving around the apartment, getting ready for something. When I checked the time, it was barely 7 a.m. on a Sunday, unusually early for either of us to be up after a late night of hosting. By the time I made it to the kitchen, Marcus was already dressed and gathering his things like he was planning to leave. Not just stepping out for coffee or a quick errand, but packing a gym bag and grabbing his laptop like he intended to be gone for most of the day. I asked where he was going, trying to keep my tone light and casual despite the growing anxiety in my chest. He told me he had some work to catch up on and thought he'd spend the day at the office where he could focus better. This was completely out of character for Marcus, who was religious about maintaining work-life balance and had never voluntarily gone to the office on a weekend in the entire time I'd known him. When I offered to make breakfast or suggested we could spend the morning together before he left, he declined politely but firmly. He needed to get going, he said, wanted to make the most of the day while he felt motivated to tackle his project backlog. The excuses were reasonable enough, but everything about his body language and tone suggested he was creating distance rather than genuinely prioritizing work responsibilities. He wasn't making eye contact, wasn't engaging in our usual morning banter, wasn't showing any of the reluctance he normally displayed when work obligations interfered with our weekend time together. He left the apartment with a quick goodbye that felt more like something you'd say to a roommate than a long-term romantic partner. No kiss, no affectionate touching, no indication of when he'd be back or what we might do together later in the day. After he left, I spent the morning trying to convince myself that I was overreacting to what was probably just a coincidence of timing and mood. Maybe he really did have work to catch up on. Maybe the party had been more exhausting for him than usual. Maybe he was dealing with stress from other areas of his life that had nothing to do with my Drake comment. But as the hours passed with no communication from him, it became increasingly clear that something significant had shifted between us. Marcus was usually very communicative throughout the day, sending me funny links or photos, checking in about plans, sharing random observations about whatever he was doing. That Sunday, my phone stayed silent. I tried texting him a few casual messages, asking how the work was going, sharing a funny meme I thought he'd appreciate, suggesting dinner plans for later. The messages showed as delivered but not read, which was unusual for someone who typically responded to texts within minutes. By late afternoon, I was alternating between anger and anxiety, unable to concentrate on anything else while I waited for some kind of acknowledgement or explanation. I cleaned the apartment thoroughly, started and abandoned several different activities, checked my phone obsessively for any sign that Marcus was planning to communicate or come home. When he finally returned that evening, it was with the same polite distance that had characterized his departure. He thanked me for cleaning up, asked if I'd had a good day, made small talk about his work projects. But underneath the surface civility, it was clear that the warmth and ease of our relationship had been replaced by something much more formal and guarded. That night, we went through the motions of our normal routine, cooking dinner together, watching a movie, getting ready for bed. But everything felt hollow and performative. Marcus was physically present but emotionally absent, going through the familiar patterns of our shared life without any of the genuine connection that usually made those patterns meaningful. The following week brought a new level of emotional torture as Marcus's withdrawal from our relationship became more systematic and deliberate. What had started as cold politeness after the party evolved into something much more devastating: the complete absence of the intimacy and connection that had defined our relationship for 2 years. Marcus continued going through all the practical motions of being my boyfriend. He still came home every night, still split household responsibilities, still maintained our social calendar, and shared commitments. But it was like living with a polite stranger who happened to know all my routines and preferences. The conversations became purely functional. Discussions about grocery shopping, scheduling, logistics for upcoming events we'd already committed to attending together. Gone were the random observations, the inside jokes, the long discussions about everything and nothing that had filled our days before the party. Most painful was the complete absence of physical affection. Marcus had always been naturally tactile, constantly reaching for my hand or putting an arm around me, or finding excuses to touch me throughout the day. Now he maintained careful physical distance, positioning himself just far enough away that casual contact would require deliberate effort rather than happening naturally. In bed, he stayed on his side of the mattress like there was an invisible barrier running down the middle. No goodnight kisses, no unconscious cuddling during sleep, no lazy morning conversations while we slowly woke up together. We were sharing a bed, but existing in completely separate worlds. I tried multiple times to address what was happening between us, to force a conversation about the party and my Drake comment and whatever damage needed to be repaired, but Marcus had perfected the art of deflection, acknowledging my concerns while simultaneously making it clear that he didn't want to discuss the situation in any meaningful depth. He'd listen politely when I tried to explain my perspective, nod appropriately when I apologized for any misunderstanding, then redirect the conversation to something practical or surface level. It was like talking to a customer service representative who was trained to be helpful without ever actually resolving the underlying problem. The most frustrating part was that I couldn't pinpoint exactly what I was supposed to be apologizing for or fixing. The Drake comment had been meant as harmless fun, and I genuinely couldn't understand how it had been interpreted as something threatening or hurtful enough to justify this level of relationship disruption. But Marcus's continued withdrawal made it clear that something fundamental had been damaged, even if I couldn't fully grasp what or how. Wednesday morning brought a development that made everything infinitely worse. I woke up to find Marcus already gone from bed, which had become his new normal since the party. But when I checked my phone, I discovered he'd posted something on his Instagram story overnight. The post was a simple text image with white words on a black background that read, "Sometimes jokes just tell the truth." No context, no explanation, just that single sentence that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. The implications were immediately clear. Marcus was essentially announcing to anyone who followed him that someone in his life had made a joke that revealed their true feelings, and that this revelation had been painful enough to warrant public commentary. While he hadn't mentioned me by name or provided specific details, anyone who knew us well would be able to connect the dots. Our friends who'd been at the party would definitely understand the reference, and other people would probably start speculating about what had happened to prompt such an unusually cryptic and melancholy post from someone who typically shared much more light-hearted content. I felt completely exposed and humiliated. Marcus had taken our private relationship crisis and turned it into social media content, inviting judgment and speculation from our entire extended social network. People were probably already discussing what I might have said or done to inspire such a passive-aggressive public statement. The post also felt like a definitive interpretation of the Drake incident. Marcus wasn't just hurt by what he perceived as poor judgment or insensitivity on my part. He genuinely believed that my joke had revealed my true feelings about our relationship and my fidelity. In his mind, I hadn't made an unfortunate comment during a silly party game. I'd accidentally told the truth about wanting to cheat on him, and the humor had just been a way to make that truth more palatable. I spent most of that day crafting and deleting responses to his Instagram story, trying to find a way to address the situation without making it worse or drawing more public attention to our problems. But anything I might say would either seem defensive and guilty or would require me to air our dirty laundry in an even more public way. Instead, I tried calling him directly, hoping to force a real conversation about what the story meant and where our relationship stood. But my calls went straight to voicemail, and my texts remained unread throughout the entire day. That evening, when Marcus finally came home, he acted like nothing had happened. He greeted me normally, asked about my day, started preparing dinner like it was any other Wednesday night. When I brought up the Instagram post, he dismissed it as something random he'd seen somewhere and reposted without thinking about it too deeply. But his explanation was clearly bullshit, delivered with the same polite distance that had characterized all our interactions since the party. He wasn't going to engage with me about the real meaning behind the post any more than he was willing to discuss his feelings about the Drake comment directly. I realized that Marcus had moved into a phase of our relationship where he was systematically shutting me out while maintaining plausible deniability about doing so. He was creating distance and expressing his feelings, but in ways that didn't require him to be vulnerable or give me opportunities to defend myself or argue my perspective. It was a form of emotional warfare that felt both cruel and completely unlike the man I'd been in love with for 2 years. Thursday evening brought the final devastating blow that ended any hope I'd been maintaining about salvaging our relationship. I'd spent the day trying to think of ways to break through Marcus's emotional walls, planning a conversation that might force him to engage with me honestly about what was happening between us. The Drake comment had killed something precious and irreplaceable, not just our relationship, but also my belief that love was enough to overcome fundamental differences in values and priorities. I'd learned, in the most painful way possible, that some conflicts can't be resolved through better communication or increased effort. Sometimes people just want different things from their relationships, and recognizing that incompatibility is kinder than trying to force someone to accept a version of love that doesn't make them feel secure and valued. Marcus had been brave enough to end our relationship when he realized we weren't right for each other, even though it meant giving up 2 years of shared history and genuine affection. I was left to live with the consequences of my choices, understanding too late that my casual attitude toward commitment had cost me the most committed man I'd ever known.